So this is about you, and this is about the S. It's about you, each of you. It's also about the S. That's all I have for today. Greetings. As my introduction said, I recently joined Towson University this semester in a brand new position in the Center for Student Diversity. And when I say greetings, there are lots of ways that, if you think about a campus setting or outside in public, there are lots of ways that greetings can happen. Particularly if you're seeing or witnessing two or more men give a greeting. There's the more conventional handshake. There's the more committed hug. There's maybe the less conventional but newer fist bump. There's the bro-induced high five. And if we think outside the box, if we push our thinking and imagine other possibilities, if we were, for example, in New Zealand, there's a ritual called the hanji, which is a reminder when two people greet that we are all interrelated to each other, to ourselves, to nature, to animals, and to the earth. So as someone who has worked in college campuses for some time, I typically expect, and I see more of that, and I see more of that, but I don't see as much of that. So one of the reasons why has to do with this thing called gender. So, a couple of things. I have good news for men. Our nightmare is over. Our suffering is ended because we now have available to us products just for us. We've got lipstick. We've got man-sized soap. We've got just the special kind of sunscreen. We have our own bread. We have our own dryer sheets. We have our own man crisps. Not only do we have our own man-sized tissues in traditional size, the man size also comes in compact size. And we have, and I just saw this last week in the store, thankfully men now have their own nuts. So one of the questions I ask us to consider, one of the ways I'd like us to keep pushing our thinking is, what explains why these are available? Well, one angle is there's a company who's trying to increase profits, and there must be a demand for products just for men, right? That's possible. I also wonder what would happen if people who didn't identify as men were readily seen wanting to buy these as their preferred products. Are we still in a place where there would be a negative reaction to that? And in fact, before these specialized products existed, was there an epidemic of men not feeling comfortable buying Kleenex? I don't think so. But there's an interesting reminder. If we take the everyday products out of their element, take a step back and examine them, I think we're still seeing some pretty interesting and pretty clear messages about how gender operates. There are lots of ways to unpack gender. This cartoon does a pretty good job. It's been around for decades. It says sex is what you're born with, gender is what you're given. So it begins to tease out a number of identities that each of us identify and have, and hopefully think about. I would advance this traditional cartoon a little bit, and I'll say more about why I'm doing this later, that instead of thinking about it traditionally as sex is what you're born with, but in fact, it's something that is assigned at birth. And we're going to tease out more of sex and gender and other dimensions of identity in just a minute. So I want us to keep thinking about think differently about gender, even when we leave today and go back to our regular lives. I want to examine gender from different angles. I'd love for us to occasionally stop and think and take a step back. So for example, if I described a very high profile, still male-dominated career that only men enter And one of the ways that we recognize achievement in this career path for this man, and by the way, they're typically presenting as hypermasculine, that one of the best ways on an annual basis we recognize the best achieving ones in this career path is we give them a diamond ring. Super Bowl. So we stop and take a step back and like, oh, when it's in the context of Super Bowl championship ring, there's less of a sort of a red flag that goes up. If we think about how gender operates, how we each do gender, if I talk about the idea of doing drag, that seems to be getting more and more public attention. There are popular TV shows about drag, right? Can we take a step back and think about drag not as something that only certain people do, but as this idea of performing gender that all of us do, such that drag is both the popular TV show, but also it's something that we all do. That all kinds of ways we exist and we present ourselves are in fact just different ways of doing drag. Superheroes are seeing a popularity, especially as movies and sequels are still being made and still being watched. If we take a step back and think about how traditionally we look at male superheroes, and wouldn't it be interesting if we sort of flipped that? So, on the left, we have the more established version of superheroes. Had we envisioned, what if we took the ways in which the occasional but rare female superhero is presented, and we ask us to think about how the men would look? What happens? What's our reaction? What would happen if we expected the male superheroes to actually present themselves in a way that the occasional or the rare woman superhero has to? If we look at the ways that they're posed when they try to sell their movies on the movie poster, if we flipped it, what happens to our reactions? If we think about the intentional ways in which we pose certain bodies based on gender, and if we flip it, what happens? It's at least a reminder. Now, to be clear, there's no judgment attached to this. It's not saying that one is correct and one isn't, but I want us to take a step back and imagine what's the message behind it if that's the only and popular way that we're going to see certain kinds of people and certain kinds of superheroes. And the last example I'll give for how the world out there shows us things and also gives us subtle and occasionally explicit messages about gender. Motorcycles are still seen as predominantly an interesting product for men. That's not accurate, but a lot of motorcycles want to target their advertising for men. And they typically do that by showing the motorcycle and not a man, but a woman. So take a step back and flip it. What would happen if a motorcycle campaign instead took the traditional posed body but just flipped it? What's our reaction, and would it in fact affect the sales of it? Questions to think about. So when I say this is about you and this is about the S, the you part is, what is each of ours investment in gender being done the way that it is right now? How am I invested in that there's a certain, apparently a more appropriate way for men to behave and an appropriate way for women to behave? What is my actual investment? Does it relate to how I've been trained and raised and socialized to think about what is appropriate for me? And what happens when I challenge that, when I step outside the box? Well, what it means is we still see in the US and beyond, we still see increasing levels of harassment, of bullying, or worse, simply based upon the perception of how one is. So getting us to think about what it means for each of us is for you to decide. Again, there's no correct answer I'm advocating here, but I do want to keep asking the question of what's my investment in the way this is being done. And then in terms of ways to expand our thinking, these diagrams take 4 different dimensions of identity, meaning we each should think about how we might identify on each of the continuum. This is more conventional in their approach. So for the first one, for example, we typically think of what I call the binary of two options, that in terms of how one identifies, we typically think of, well, most people would identify as either woman or man, right? Well, conventionally speaking, but there are other options. So this framework is a starting point, but I do want to push us even more. I want to push us beyond this idea. So to envision that on any of these continuum, there's one pole over here and one over here, then we're seeing the possibilities for others in the middle point. Let's even flip that some more. So I want to introduce you to the gender unicorn. Let's unpack this. So the unicorn, the 4 parts to think about. The thought process, the thought bubble, that's gender identity. How one sees themselves. So it's internal. It's the cloud. The green dotted line is the gender expression, the whole package, how one presents to themselves and to others. The 2 hearts have to do with both physical and emotional attraction, and the DNA helix, where we think of the genitals, has to do with sex assigned at birth. So in the actual diagram, again, I'm asking you to think about how would each of us identify on every single line, any colored line or colored block. Taking the first 2. Gender identity. Instead of the original diagram of woman over here, man over here, to ask us each to think about all of them for each of us. So in the first block, think about where each of us might identify in terms of how they identify. So, for example, if I identify as a man, on the second line, I would presumably say, well, I would identify near the end. But how do I identify as a woman? Well, if parts of me, well, in some ways I am, in some ways I'm not, but just the process of having to figure out where might I place myself. That's the pushing of the thinking I'm talking about. In terms of otherness, are there parts of me that I see as not necessarily gendered, it's just who I am? It's that in-between. That's the third blue line. Similarly, for the gender expression, the green dotted line, the entire unicorn, how they present. So run back to the images of the advertisements of the products. Instead of saying either you present masculine or feminine, and by going high on one, you must be therefore low on the other, that's the one line. Make it 3 lines, it gets more confusing and says, oh, I have to think about for a minute on each of these dimensions, where would I conventionally most days, how do I express myself? Maybe it's low on one, high on this one, and there are parts of me that tend to sort of present as androgynous. But just the process in your mind of having to think about where do I identify along those, that's the main process. So when I say pushing our thinking, it's thinking differently and in more dimensions. So when I say this is about you, that's the process, is ask the questions for yourself and for others. When I say this is about the S, that means, are we seeing more possibilities for what it means for all genders? For masculinity in general, masculinity, if you think about this is about you, all of us, and the S, that means think about masculinities in the plural. That different based on how old you are, based on your other identities like race and class, nation of origin, your religion, each of those intersects with how I think about what it means to be a man. So making it about you and making it about the S, the plural, making room for more possibilities. So that I wonder if, in the context of a college campus, what would it take, and can we imagine getting to a place pretty soon where we might see more possibilities? Thinking about sex assigned at birth, the original cartoon that I showed. Instead of reducing it to the false either or of two choices only, we now know those are not the only possibilities. There is, in fact, more variation. And then the last 2 parts of the unicorn diagram, it actually splits out attraction, what we think of typically as just sexual orientation. It splits it in both physical and emotional. So if you remember the image of what I call the dude-induced high five, thinking about it separately from physical and emotional makes more room for example, for men to say, oh, men can actually acknowledge and admit that they have a friendship and a closeness and a love for their friends that is platonic and not sexual, but it's important to them. If you split that into both physical attraction as well as emotional, it makes just more room and more possibilities for the ways that we live our lives and the ways that we see ourselves and the ways that we relate to each other. So when I say it's about the S, it's about the plural, the more possibilities. So hopefully, we can get to a point that our campus, our community, our town, makes it more okay, gives us more possibilities, gives us more options for how men can be themselves and how they can greet each other. Thank you.